Welcome to this afternoon's second Catapult virtual Salon with Beatriz Llenín Figueroa, who lives and works in Puerto Rico. I'm Bagoo. I'm a writer here in Trinidad and Tobago, but today I'll be getting to cross the boundaries and to visit Puerto Rico. If you're like me and you've been enjoying this series of lockdowns, I'd like to take a moment to express my thanks to Catapult partners, including the American Friends of Jamaica, Kingston Creative, and Fresh Milk for making this series happen. So today we're talking to Beatriz Llenín Figueroa. Beatriz's research and creative work revolves around Caribbean literatures and philosophies, island studies, gender, and queer theory. She holds a PhD from Duke University's program in literature and is currently an adjunct professor of comparative literature and humanities at the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez. She also works as an editor and is an essayist published internationally. During this conversation, please feel free to ask us questions in the comments section, and we'll get to those in a Q&A segment at the end. But now, without further ado, let's welcome Beatriz.
Hi, Andre. Hi, everyone that's online right now, and everyone that might see this later. I'm really very grateful to you, Andre, and to everyone involved with making this series happen. I know from talking with other artists who've been here or who've been watching the series, that this has really transformed our lives in these difficult times, to say the least. So thank you again, and thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. So, I mean, you mentioned these difficult times. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about how are you feeling right now?
There's, I think there's a lot of angst, pain, panic that I think responds to, in Puerto Rico, to a series of overlapping disasters and tragedies and very difficult situations that have to do with natural processes, hurricanes, earthquakes, etc., but also to do with our species' performance in the bad sense of the word, but also that have to do with the political situation of our archipelago here, as you all know, as a colony of the United States. And these United States in particular, well, I don't have to say, I think everyone is aware of the situation right now. So in general, there's that, but I feel like it's also a moment where we also had elections here this past Tuesday, and I feel some pretty significant things happened as a result of those elections. And although we still have these two main or institutional parties that have been controlling local politics here for several decades now, they're still flapping their decrepit wings. There were some significant changes, and some amazing people were voted into the legislative bodies here, people who are lifelong, who have been involved in struggles for justice throughout their lives. And so we're thrilled about that and about the possibilities of extending the impulse of what we had here last summer, the 2019 summer, where we were able to oust the governor at that point. So I would say, it's a mixed bag, but we're in the struggle.
Wow, I mean, it sounds like Puerto Rico is very much right now, like so many other places in the world, in a kind of a liminal space. And I think on that note, I understand that you would like to share with us, to begin our conversation, a video that you've actually prepared.
Yes, I'd like to thank my friend Christopher Powers, who helped me with this sort of on a very short notice. It's a piece I wrote thinking in particular about this event and what I've been undergoing through watching and feeling the people who have come before me in this series. And it's also a piece that responds to the work of one of the performers and artists that I'll be talking about today too, Teresa Hernandez. So one of her recent pieces, it also responds to that. So it's a little bit of everything. And I really just wanted to share that as a writing sample with people listening, and then continue the amazing dialogue with you, Andre.
La isla presume otras islas, Antillas. El gigantesco llamado del horizonte de la tierra nos es desconocido. No podríamos vagar sin fin hacia los límites siempre retraídos, pero buscamos alimento. Nuestro rol será convocar. La isla es un anfiteatro con gradas oceánicas, en la que la representación es tentación del mundo. Edouard Glissant, Intención poética. The island presumes other islands, Antilles. The giant call of the earth's horizon is unknown to us. We could not wander without end to the ever withdrawn limits, but we forage. Our role will be to convene. The island is an amphitheater with ocean stands, where representation is temptation of the world. Edouard Glissant, Poetic Intention. ¿Cómo caer en la tentación? How to fall into temptation. Quiero decir, that is to say, cómo tocar y dejarnos tocar. How to touch and let ourselves be touched. Por, desde y para, by, from and for. Las otras islas presumidas por las mías y las tuyas. The other islands presumed by mine and yours. En días claros podemos ver nuestras siluetas elevadas sobre la superficie, un milagro. On clear days we can see our silhouettes elevated above the surface, a miracle. Tanta cercanía invitaría a rozarnos de corales. Such proximity seems an invitation to grace us with corals, a salarnos de mutua preservación, to salt us in mutual preservation. Aspiro a leer para el horizonte. I aspire to read for the horizon, pero el amo ha levantado murallas en el agua, but the master has raised walls on the water. Alcanzo a pie el litoral de Boquerón, último que viera Betances en su huida de su tan hermoso país y tan desgraciado. I reach Boquerón's littoral on foot, the last coast Betances saw in his flight from his such a beautiful country and so miserable. Vago en la arena vuelta a tierra, I wander on the sand-turned land, en la tierra devenida arena, on the land that became sand. Acontece en el tan hermoso y desgraciado país, todo imaginable desastre. In the beautiful and miserable country, every imaginable disaster rages on. Me abro la piel con la inyección de nuestro anfiteatro. I open my flesh with our amphitheater's injection. Glissant, amado, Glissant, beloved, con la vacuna de tu horizontal convocatoria, with the vaccine of your horizontal call. Convoco y me dejo convocar. I convene and I let myself be convened. Desde la estela de legados multitudinarios como el tuyo, from the wake of multitudinous legacies such as yours, todo tiempo caribeño puede ser nuestro tiempo. Every Caribbean time can be our time, y el nuestro puede ser de hace siglos, and our time can be that of centuries ago. ¿Cómo acuchillar la muralla del amo? How to knife the master's wall? Desde la pequeñez de un cuerpo isla, from the smallness of a body island, que no hace otra cosa que arte, that does nothing else but art, que es lo mismo que decir que lo hace todo, which is the same as saying that it does it all, que es lo mismo que decir que sobrevive pese a todo, which is the same as saying that it survives in spite of it all, que es lo mismo que decir que abre pasadizos por los que las islas nos tocamos, which is the same as saying that it opens passages through which we, the islands, touch each other. Como una araña en su tan sutil ejercicio de hacerse casa, like a spider in its oh so subtle exercise of making itself a home, de la que penden las gotas de rocío que presumen el océano, from which hang drops of dew that presume the ocean, y al interior de la cual, and within which, nunca habrá, nunca, muralla que valga. There will never, ever be a wall to speak of.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I mean, I was just struck by so many lines in that, but in particular, the island presumes other islands. In the beautiful and miserable country, every imaginable disaster rages on. I think you could not have produced a piece more fitting for this moment, which leads me to this question. This video work is very interesting because, of course, it involves you performing your poetry, which you've written as well. And then there's a performative aspect of you also being in there in the still images, for instance. And, I've seen you make reference before to how your work is attempting to overturn all of the distinctions between creative and academic writing, between formal essays and everyday women's writing, so there's this kind of interweaving of different forms and mediums in your overall practice. And, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that. What is the source of that? What is your interest in that?
I think there are several sort of currents that cross each other from where that comes from. One of the things I think has to do with trying to understand and experience and undergo writing as a performative practice in itself, in the sense that it can, and I think it should, try to open a space to witness this place that I live in and that I love in and love from. And historically, that has a lot of weight for places such as Puerto Rico, but also I'm sure that this can be said, and people watching this can contradict or confirm it. But I would imagine this also is a sensation, a historical sensation in other places in the Caribbean, just from being historically so dramatically subjected to all unspeakable kinds of violence. And in that sense, writing, trying to produce a space from which to witness, which means, and to sort of accompany a process of trying to transform and come to terms with that history, but also because witnessing entails that one thinks there's future, right? If you witness something, you're witnessing it actively because you believe you want to say something about that because you think there's a future. And I think that also is something that I feel deeply that writing can do, sort of make us fall in love with the concept of the future in a place where, things have been pretty dire especially over the last 4 years since the approval of PROMESA by the U.S. Congress, and all that has happened since. But I think also just the trying also to make writing something that is not verified and that it's not something that is produced by some kind of transcendent inspiration, but it actually happens on an everyday basis. I'm really interested in things like lists and things that you would just write, in the middle of trying to juggle an impossible situation, in the middle of trying to juggle, 2 or 3 jobs, in the middle of trying to juggle the destruction of all that was cherished as public services in the country, health, education, etc. So writing becomes this practice, literally, on a daily basis, that I think it's also something I'm interested in. And then also the materiality of the word itself. I was talking with a friend of mine yesterday just about this. The materiality of the word, trying to find ways to write in order for it to become a material, an object in itself, with things like repetition and other kinds of experiments in writing. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I also want to say is I feel this also comes from my more formal education in comparative literature. I feel I owe that tradition or that method of encountering literature. I owe this sense of thinking about literature in relation, in connection with, and that has been also very transformative for me. Because comparative literature thinks about literature in comparison with not only other pieces of writing, but also, all kinds of cultural manifestations and even other areas of knowledge production. And that has also informed quite a bit my understanding of writing as performative, and performance art also as possibility of writing with the body. And this, the idea of being able to think about an archive, especially in a place like this too, beyond the written word also, and try to find the traces of resistance and liberation in places where there might not be a written word that the West has taught us is the legitimate evidence or archive. And so that's also why I'm very interested in theater and performance, for instance, because I feel there's an archive there that we have to look at.
Yeah, and certainly there's a coherence to that archive when cited within the body, with all of its politics, So in case you're now joining us, I'm Andre Bagoo, and we are discussing today, we're here in this virtual salon with Beatriz Llenín Figueroa, and we're having this wonderful discussion, and we've just seen this great video, and I actually wanted to ask you a little bit more about that process of putting the video together. I mean, because especially hearing you talk about all of these interweaving elements, how did you do it? Which came first? What was the comparative influence on that verse that you wrote? Did you get the poem first, or how did it go?
Yeah, that's great that you asked me that, because it makes me think, oh yeah, a lot of things came together there that I didn't realize necessarily when I wanted to write something for this today, especially for this. I didn't want to read something that I had already written, but wanted to really try to process a little bit of the experience of listening and learning from all the amazing, wonderful artistic and political work and intellectual work that has been brought together in the Lockdown Virtual Salon series. That was one thing that I was responding to when I was writing that. But then also it has to do with this book project I'm engaged in for a while now. And for instance, that line that you really like, the such a beautiful country and so miserable, it's a line from Betances, this extremely important political thinker and organizer and writer in the 19th century, who was one of the main advocates of the idea of an Antillean confederation. And I'm really interested in his figure and in his context, and I've been studying that. And there's a really moving letter where he tells this friend of his, Lola Rodriguez de Tio, also a famous poet, a woman actually, of the 19th century. And so he's retelling her the story of his flight from the Spanish government. He had to flee the country because of his political activities. He was an abolitionist and a Republican in the 19th century Republican sense. And he had to flee, and he's telling this story. And so when I found that letter, in the story he explains that he was fleeing with his friend Segundo Ribelvis, who was also an abolitionist and a radical, and they ran aground on the Boquerón littoral, and I live 5 minutes from that coast. And so it was a very moving experience to imagine this sort of archipelagic life that Betances led, having been launched from 5 minutes from my house. And so this video was shot in the Boquerón littoral. We don't really know exactly where he ran aground in that coastline. He explains, he says, there was this tree, and he had a fever, he was really sick, so he had to crawl in order to say his last goodbye to the country. It's a really moving letter. And so although I don't know if we were exactly where he was, where he experienced this, I wanted to do the video there in that coast. So that's why it's there. And my friend Christopher did all the video stuff. I have no clue about how to do that. And it was actually great because we just had that morning to do that, and it turns out it was raining, as you can see. And so I was first kind of like bummed, like we're not going to be able to do this. But then he was great because he said, no, we have to shoot the rain. And it turned out great because it really contests the overdetermination of the, tropical, sunny, palm trees, tourist exploitation image of the Caribbean. So I was actually, really happy that it turned out to be that way on that morning. And then there's also a response to two other things. I'm going to try to be quick with the last two things because I'm talking too much.
No, you're not talking too much. We're eating it up.
Thank you, Andre. You're really generous. So the other two things that come together in that poem are, I'm also studying the trajectory and work of the Puerto Rican artist Teresa Hernandez. She's the one you can see with the knife against this wall. It's a piece that's part of a bigger project that she's, it's still ongoing. It's called Bravatas. And in that piece, she's in Vieques, an island municipality of our archipelago in Puerto Rico. And there's this little, this fortress, really, it's called La Fortín. It's from, Spanish times. And as part of that piece, her sort of, I don't want to say character because it's not a character in the sort of traditional theater way, but it's la mujer del cuchillo, the woman with the knife. Now that phrase in Spanish in Puerto Rico is really loaded, and I'm not going to go into that right now, but because I don't want to take so long. But it really,
now you have to go into it.
Well, just a little bit. It's a really powerful image of it culturally means something like, if you mess with me, you're in trouble. You're going to be in big trouble. I'm carrying the knife on my mouth.
So then, is it like the trope of the mad woman that you might see in English literature? No. It's
actually a thoroughly empowered image of a woman who's and in this piece, it's really amazing because she makes us feel as though this woman can actually knife down with a kitchen knife a fortress wall, a colonial fortress wall. And so that, to me, I'm studying that as part of this book that I'm trying to write. And that image in particular was really, really powerful. And I was responding to that in the poem too. And then the last thing with the spider web in the end, one of the things that's been amazing of the very few things that have been really good in these pandemic times is that I started doing this weekly walk with two very, very intimate and deep friends of mine here, and it's actually around the Boquerón coast too, but in a more like wooded reserve area. And and other friends have also come too, beyond these two friends. But this is the regular thing that's become a routine, and it's been really healing and important to navigate these times, this weekly. Now I have to do that every week, or else I lose my mind. And so in that experience, I'm actually writing about that too separately. The experience of sort of learning to walk again in a much more attentive and alert way, as also a decolonial exercise, because we are impelled to look away and to look elsewhere. You know, there's nothing for you here. This place, this is a tomb. You know, we're lacking everything. It's a very powerful discourse that I associate with an imperial understanding of the concept of island. And I learned, a lot about that from Lissette, which is also something I'm responding to, because I love Lissette.
Yes.
I call him my beloved because I really do love him. And I could read his work every day. And so that one of the things that I noticed recently was this spider web. And it was on the floor, which I had never even seen. I had always seen spider webs on the sides of places, but not on the floor. And it also had this different quality. It wasn't circular as the more usual spider webs one can see. And so I just sat down next to it and just devoted some time to observe it. And that's where I felt a deep connection between if we could really knife down the master's wall, we could really build this spider web in its place where there's no possible wall. And so I mean, I think it's also the poem is also a response to these times which seem like impossible to live through, and at the same time I don't want to lose my humanity, which means I don't want to lose the idea that the future is still possible. And so we can still, we're in the struggle to actually make for ourselves a spider web instead of a wall. I truly believe we can do this.
Wow, I mean, there's a powerful alchemy there, and it was really fitting for you to begin the poem with that mention of the amphitheater of the islands, and you just, it's the imperial notion of island, as you just mentioned, but also it's tied for you, this whole process of coming to terms with things, to the land. You seem to have, my impression is that it's very important to you to have a clear connection to the actual physical space. And so I'm wondering, how important is that to you? And is there a source for that kind of rootedness in that area in which you live, or maybe the community in which you grew up?
Well, I actually grew up rather far from where I live now. I grew up in Isabela, which is another rural town, but it's a coastal town too, like Cabo Rojo, where I live now. But I grew up in the sort of rural side of this town, and actually had rather little experience of the beach, although this town, Isabela, is kind of world famous for its beaches, and there's like surfing competitions there and all of that. But my family wasn't really into the going to the beach thing. And so I was raised in a coastal town very famous for its beaches, and I barely knew its beaches really growing up. And so coming to live where I live now, I've tried to make it a point to have a more quotidian bodily experience of the coast. And yes, you're right. There is an effort to connect with this place. I actually feel like I studied, or I always try to study Caribbean literatures and philosophies, and I do have a very strong sense that I decided to do that in part in order to fall in love with where I come from. Because like I said before, there's such a long history of loathing and disdain, and always thinking that there's something wrong. I'm moved now. I'm a really profuse crier, so these things happen. I might cry.
Join the club. We've all been crying these last few days. It's okay.
Oh my goodness, it's just too much. But so yeah, so I feel like, yes, it's true. What I try to study has to do with trying to fall in love with this place and trying to find also ways, roots in the ROUTES sense, to come back and stay, to be able to stay. I really want to stay, although it is very difficult for various reasons. And then that has also crossed over to my writing. I ask this question to myself every time I try to write, which is, how can you write from a place of love, and how can you write from a place of love for a place that has not been loved, has not nearly been loved enough, and then there's also a tension I feel with there is a tradition in Puerto Rico of national literature that is very much rooted in the land, to the detriment of the coast and the sea and the region and the Caribbean region, and that I think is historically comprehensible, in the sense that a lot of that literature has to do with resisting. It's nationalistic in the sense of opposing U.S. imperialism, and it found on the trope of land a sort of like how would you say it, like something to hold on to that was very important. In the first few decades of the 20th century. So when I say fall in love with the land, I mean to say also, how can you write from that place of trying to love a place that has not been loved, but without it being this sort of essentialist celebration of the interior of the island. Trying to make that falling in love. I really want us to fall in love with our region, to understand ourselves as part of the Caribbean region. And historically for Puerto Rico, that has proven quite difficult, because we've been torn between the forces that only want us to look to the United States or to anything basically that's in the north, because it's better and amazing, and that's where democracy is. We know how that goes. But then torn between that, and then the people who oppose that and resist that have really systematically told us that, we have to look to the Latin American republics. And that's there's a strong sort of Hispanophile tradition there that thinks of Puerto as linked exclusively with the Latin American republics, primarily because of the shared Spanish colonization and the language, etc. And of course, there are a lot of connections there, but I'm really passionate and interested in trying to make us think and dream and connect with what actually I think is a much closer and deeper and more intimate connection, which is with the wider Caribbean region. And that entails us to not be set on the land, but actually we have to move to the sand, which is, the place where, as you said, it's the liminal space. We have to find a way to be there, both the land and the sea and the horizon, and so yeah.
Oh, that's so incredible. It's a civic love that opens the door and gives permission to all sorts of other, personal loves, family love, relationships and stuff. It strikes me, as you mentioned your book as well, that one of the things that I've noticed is a very strong current within you and within your writing is this fusion between, for instance, a very critical faculty. Maybe criticism might be too dry a word, but there's a critical faculty in terms of how you approach and analyze art that sits very neatly alongside your very deep philosophical engagement with all of these almost psychogeographic issues. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your current project that you mentioned, where you're taking these two key figures, and it's discussing them along those lines.
Well, I'm really grateful for this question because I wanted to think also about this session today as a kind of a little bit of a workshop space. I would love for people to respond if they want to this project that I'm in, because there's nothing if not relation, and no thought is individual, or it doesn't happen by itself or by one single mind. So it was really important to me to be able to be in conversation with you, Andre, but also with everyone else that watches this, to be in dialogue and to maybe get feedback too, and maybe questions or challenges. So the book, yes, I've been working on that for, I don't know, maybe over 5 years now, I think, and it has changed. It has changed because the situation in the country has changed dramatically over the same period of time. And it comes from that study that I was explaining a while ago, the study of islands, of archipelagos, but specifically about our region and its philosophies and literatures. It comes from there, but it has morphed, and it now is a book more about trying to say that although all of what I said a few minutes ago is true about Puerto Rico being torn between the pendulum of the North and the Latin American republics, and that is the institutional story. It's the story you can find in the institutional parties, political parties. It's the story you can find in our cultural institutions like el Instituto de Cultura Puertorriqueña. It's the story you can find there. But so the idea of the book is, okay, we really have to look beyond the institutional story. And so the idea is that I want to say that there is an effective archive in Puerto Rico that cuts across several kinds of art, including literature, but also including live arts, the arts of the body, and especially performance and theater, and but also, explicitly political figures such as Betance. Yes. And I also study Albizu Campos, which is the foremost nationalist in Puerto Rico from the 30s and 40s. Luisa Capetillo.
And that's important. Because your working title is Towards Puerto Rico's Decolonial Democratic Futures.
Yeah, and I also want to say that even in institutional instances, such as, for instance, the Partido Nacionalista and Pedro Albizu Campos' role, leadership role there, I want to also be able to say that there is a very strong performative element in the good sense of the word, because I know that people sometimes use that word to demean something. If something is performative, they mean to say that is, it's a lie. That, for instance, one can understand Albizu as someone very, very deeply aware of the performative quality of occupying a political space. And if you listen to his speeches, if you see how he conducted himself, if you even analyze his choice of dress, there's a very important thing there about the way he embodied his resistance. And if you think about the sort of the tribuna aesthetics, you know, taking the platform that is also very much tied to a tradition of resistance that is associated with the tabaqueras and tabaqueros in Puerto Rico, the workers of tobacco. And that actually allows me to connect with Luisa Capetillo, which is what I'm doing right now in the past couple of months as part of the book is I'm trying to study Luisa Capetillo, our amazing, exceptional feminist, anarchist, political organizer, also dramatist, writer. I'm trying to say several things about her, but what I'm writing.
I think you have an image that you'd like to share with us.
I was forgetting about the images. Yes. If we can see image number 2, please, Kyle. Thank you. So that people can see Capetillo. Yes, this is Luisa Capetillo, and one of the things I'm really interested in saying, in being able to say, is that there's, you know, one of the stories that keeps being repeated about her is this moment where on the image on the right, where she has more quote unquote masculine clothes, is from an intervention she did in Havana, in Cuba, and that story gets retold a lot, as though it was the only instance where she went out in public dressed as she shouldn't dress because she was a woman. I'm saying all of this in quotations, of course. But it turns out that from doing research on newspapers, it turns out that she did this repeatedly. And she did this in Puerto Rico, this kind of performative intervention in the street, of taking the street with something that she wasn't supposed to. And she did this also in New York, as one of the newspaper articles evidences. And I was really interested in that, because then it becomes something, then her political thinking becomes something more than just the archive of her writing. And I'm trying to say that there's a writing here with her body that she's doing through these repeated taking over the street, so to speak, with a very strategic use of clothing as resistance. I was listening to Lauren Bacchus recently, a scholar, an artist too of textiles, and she was talking about the several traditions of resistance and subversion through dress in different regions of the Caribbean, of the Francophone and Anglophone Caribbean. And I think I was very much inspired by that, because I think there's something like that going on with Capetillo. And this is, the first decade of the 20th century, right after the invasion of the U.S. And so, she's doing this right at the onset of U.S. imperialism in Puerto Rico, and actually, I think, transforming forever the possibilities and the lives for women in our country. And I think that this.
And do you see some similarities between that moment and, is it Teresa Hernandez?
Yes. And so that's what I'm working on trying to say too, that these instances of our effective archive of resistance and also of connection with the sea and with the Caribbean more generally, if we go beyond the written word, we'll find it in a bodily archive. So I was working with a piece from 2014. So it's like a century after Capetillo. Teresa Hernandez, if we can see the image number 3, Kyle. It's a piece called Aparecer that the artist did in San Juan too. This is just a couple of blocks away from where Capetillo did her intervention in San Juan that was covered in the newspapers like it was this huge scandal. And I study that piece of the newspaper. It's a horrible case of the most patriarchal writing you will ever find. So this is just a few blocks away in Plaza Colón in Old San Juan in Puerto Rico. This piece is called Aparecer, and I don't know if the pictures can be seen clearly, but the one on the top is a moment in the piece where the artist is walking with a cage, like a bird cage, on her head, and she's wearing this long sort of Cinderella type or wedding type gown with this extremely long tail. And again, in the context of Puerto Rico, if you say something has cola, a tail, something or someone has cola, you mean to say, that there's a lot more to it or to that person or to that situation than it might first appear. And aparecer is the name of the piece. So this woman with the tail, or this tailed woman, is taking over a public square. In interviews with the writer, she was telling me how this is connected to a very strong tradition of women taking public squares to make public an emotion that is told to us by patriarchy that is a private emotion, which is mourning and sorrow. And so she wanted to make what was an intimate, private situation she was going through that provoked a lot of mourning. It's like a botched wedding, right? It's the wedding dress that's not a wedding dress. That it's like
for you, these are two examples of resistance almost within this kind of democratic framework or a democracy of the body almost, even within this very oppressive patriarchal space. And so tell me now how do you then map that argument to the wider argument of your book?
Yes. Well, one of the things that's really important to me in the context of the book is to try to make not only a tracing of connections between written and non-written archives of resistance and Caribbean connection, but also to try and posit at least a couple of things that I think we can learn from that diverse archive in order to imagine a decolonial future for the archipelago, but also a Caribbeanist future for the archipelago. And one of the things, of course, has to do, and if any of you are familiar with news in Puerto Rico, you'll know that we are still very much submerged in gender violence, and in all its forms, the most overt, through the whole spectrum, through the most everyday type of violence that some people think is subtle. That's debatable. But the thing is, so one of the things that's really important that I want to be able to posit is where we find instances where the concerns of political resistance and gender resistance and justice and liberation come together, and how that can teach us something for the contemporary resistance in the country. Because one of the setbacks really historically of the so-called left in Puerto Rico has been its deep complicity with patriarchy in all kinds of ways. And so one of the things as I was telling you at the beginning, one of the things that we're in the struggle of transforming and changing is to actually, through the work, there's amazing work being done right now by feminist organizations such as La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción in Puerto Rico and others, but also artists, is we're trying to say, there's really not a possible horizon of decolonization and liberation for Puerto Rico if we don't have at the same time gender justice in all its forms. So that's sort of one of the angles that the book is trying to propose, to learn from the archive it studies. Then there are other things.
It's a regional outlook that you have. It's not just something isolated.
That's what I'm trying. I'm trying to connect Puerto Rico to regional concerns. Another thing that I'm not working on that at the moment, because it's like a book made of tons of threads or something. But another thing I'm really interested in is learning more about the struggle for reparations. And in Puerto Rico, we have the huge problem that because we're a U.S. colony, we're not allowed, for instance, to be active participants in things like CARICOM, for instance. So, everything that we might be able to do in order to connect with that struggle and to be part of that struggle, which I think is absolutely necessary and should be a required part of our struggle for decolonization. And one of the things I think we can do has to do with trying to connect with the struggle beyond the institutional spaces, because we're prevented from doing so. And there's some work that's being done in that direction that I'm starting to look at now. And
I think, it's definitely so relevant now, especially in light of all the things we're talking about. I mean, Puerto Rico's status as a territory or de facto colony, and I'd be interested in hearing what other people have to say or what other people have to ask. And I understand that we have some questions from viewers. And so Annalie asks, oh yes, I appreciate your bilingual video. Do you often write in both languages? Also, as someone interested in the region, how are you engaging with the wider Caribbean as a writer?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Annalie, and also thank you for your own amazing work. I've only started writing my more, let us say, creative writing in English very, very recently. So it's a very recent sort of experiment that I'm trying to embark on. And the thing is, I wish I could make my writing in English explicitly say that I'm interested in writing in English because I'm interested in connecting with the Anglophone Caribbean, and not because I'm interested in, the US so-called literary market, for instance. It's difficult to communicate that when you write in English in a place like Puerto Rico, because automatically it's understood as a gesture to respond to the US or something, or to be engaged in a conversation with the US. And of course, we have to be engaged in that conversation, and we have a robust and politically very active diaspora too that lives in the US, and that's very important. But I also want to experiment with writing in English because I want to be able to have you, Andre, read.
You have to knife the wall, that wall, so that we can connect.
I want you to be able to read it, and to I want to be able to talk with you about it. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that poem. I had the experiment of doing one line in Spanish, that line in English, one line in Spanish, was actually something I am grateful to Andre for, because Andre suggested I do it that way. I had just, the entire piece in Spanish first, and then the entire piece in English after. And I was really grateful for the idea, because I feel like it worked. It worked really well, and I still have to work on the delivery because I feel it wasn't, I mean, I feel like there's this constant sort of change that happens kind of even psychically with the tones in Spanish and in English. And so to switch like that repeatedly was a challenge. But I'm interested in continuing to do those kinds of experiments for the reasons that I've explained.
Yeah, it's wonderful, and it really ties into this idea again of this performative center to everything that you're doing, because you're literally embodying the costume of language as you navigate all of these different spaces and bring us together. I think we have another question. Your combination of the academic, creative, and poetic is beautiful. What is it like teaching comparative literatures within an academic institution? Is it conducive to this kind of fluidity / crossover? A spill the tea.
Thank you, Author Girl 44, for that question. If you are an adjunct, like I am, like I've been for the past 8 years, I think you have fundamentally two choices. You can either be completely consumed by the institution because there's a lot of a really how should I say this, kind of manipulation involved in making you think that if you follow all the rules and you obey everything, then you might at some point be able to have a steady job. Or on the contrary, you can, precisely because you're not getting a steady job anytime soon, you can sort of go under the radar or something and try to do what you really want to do. And I feel actually I'm on the verge of not being an adjunct anymore next year. So I feel now I probably would be even more fluid, to use your words, from the person who made the question. But I have to say, in the program that I've been teaching in, we have amazing students, and they have really been, for me, the protagonists of my own process in trying to find ways to teach and to connect and to put diverse texts in conversations that wouldn't be together in a more traditional classroom setting. So yes, I've tried to do that, but I have to say it has very much responded to the creative demands of our students who are brilliant and who are really, really, trying to find ways also to navigate a country that, they were born in crisis here, and they've grown up in crisis, and it's really difficult times to be an 18-year-old. It really is. And so being able to cross over in a lot of senses, I think they want that, because it also helps them to see that there are, a lot of horizons, that not everything is lost.
Fluidity, it's a great word, again, because that is a great theme in everything, and it's clearly something that's important to you.
And in our submarine connections, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think on that note, I wish we could continue this discussion. It's been so rich and rewarding, but we have to say goodbye. I'd like to thank once again the CATAPULT partners, including the American Friends of Jamaica, Kingston Creative, Fresh Milk, for making this happen. Please remember to follow all of those platforms on their social media pages, and do look out for the next virtual lockdown, which will be next week on Tuesday at 1 p.m. And it will be featuring DJ Simmons of Barbados, who will be talking to Kevin Richard Barr of Trinidad and Tobago. There will also be another lockdown on that day, virtual Salon, and that would be at 4 p.m. with 5 Stees of Jamaica. So On that note,
put all of that in your agenda, everyone who's watching. These salons are really, really, really amazing. So I hope people are going to get online next week too. Please do support this and share it with all of your friends and networks. Thanks again to everyone.
So just to use your words, Beatrice, every Caribbean time can be our time. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, Andre. Goodbye.